Let's take a look at the paramify-object-keys function that we need to create. And this is a follow-up from the paramify function. So it's going to be very similar, but we're going to use a different function in this solution called object.keys. So let's begin. Works on an empty object. Here we have paramify-object-keys. It takes in an empty object and returns a string. Now, just a note, notice all these x's I have in front of my if functions. I manually added those myself. They weren't included in your test specs. I did this. I added them in front to put the other test specs in a pending state. And let me show you what that looks like just in case you haven't seen this before. Notice all these other specs are in this kind of this star looking thing. That means they're in a pending state and they're currently not running. So after we pass the first spec, which is the first spec in paramify-object-keys, I'll take the x out and enable that second test spec to run, and then the third test spec to run, and so on. So works on an object. We need to solve this test spec first. And this is the one spec we have currently running. So we need to create a function called paramify-object-keys. It takes in an object as an argument, so we need to find that parameter placeholder. And for now, it just returns an empty string. And this is the core structure of this function paramify-object-keys. So let's save this, see if we're passing, which we are, and great. We can move on to the next spec because our paramify-object-keys fulfills all the requirements that the first spec had for us. Now let's continue. To continue, I'll remove the x, I'll save my loopspec.js file, and now let's see if we're passing or failing, which we're failing in this case. So we're returning an empty string, but we should return size equals 14. So if we look at this, paramify-object-keys takes in an object. This object has one key value pair, and what we want to do is return a string with the key value pair separated by an equal sign. So let's see how we can do this. Instead of making a for in loop like we did with the paramify function, what I'm going to use instead is this method called object.keys. And object.keys takes in an object as an argument, and it returns an array. And this array holds all the key names that were on the object passed into it. So let me show you an example here in the browser. And I'm going to grab an object from another test spec, just so we have a bigger object with more key value pairs inside of it. So here I call object.keys, and I'm passing in an object. And notice this object literal has 6 keys on it. It has A, B, C, D, E, F. And the value returned from object.keys is an array with all the key names in the array as indexes. So this is what it looks like. Notice we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It's just an array, and that's what object.keys returns. So using this idea, let's go ahead and create an array. So I'll call const array of key names. And then I want to loop over this array of key names. And there's multiple ways to loop over an array. You can use for each, you can use map, you can use other things. For now, I'm just going to stick to a for loop. But feel free to use any other method that you're comfortable with. So here we have for, let I is 0, while I is less than array of key names. Dot length, I++. There we go. So we're looping over this. And what we want to do now is try to create this string inside of our loop. So I'll create another variable here, let final string. It's currently an empty string. And I'll call final string plus equals. We'll use a template literal here. And first, we need to get the name of the key that we're currently on or iterating over inside of our for loop. So here's an array of key names. It has an array of individual key names inside of it. So I'll call array of key names, pass an I to get the current key that we're iterating on. The next portion of this is to add the equal sign in between the key name and the value. So I'll say equals. And last but not least, we have to get the value. So we already accessed the key right here. So just to make our code a little bit cleaner, what I'm going to do is take out that expression, create a new variable here called letKey, and assign the key name to this variable. Now what I can do is just pass in key here. So this is a little cleaner. And then when I access the value using this key, I can just call this, right? obj key. This makes our code a little bit cleaner here. If not, we would have to use this twice, and it'll be a little bit bloated and harder to read. So let's go with this approach for now. Now after we generate this string, what do we have to do? At the end of our for loop or after our for loop, we just have to return final string. So we'll save this code. Let's go ahead and see if we're passing the first and second test spec still. So we're still passing the first spec. Excellent job. And let's see if we're passing the next test spec, which we are. Convert an object with one element. So we're passing the first two. Let's move on. Convert an object with two elements. Okie dokie. So let's remove the X. We'll save this code. And now we'll see if we're failing, which we are. These specs are almost identical to the other test specs for paramify. So notice why we're failing. We have a key value pair here. The string for that looks correct, but the way we're connecting both of those key value pairs that we have here is incorrect. We need to have the and symbol in between. So we have to add this logic to our function. Before we pushed everything into an array in the paramify function, and then we joined on the array. Just for now, let's kind of go through the logic for this. So let's see here. After we add the core string onto our final string, we want to determine whether or not we are at the end of our array. And we can do this a few ways. And actually, let me change that statement. We want to determine whether or not we are not at the end of our array. So I can just create an if statement here and say if I does not equal array of key names dot length minus 1. If it doesn't equal that value, then we'll step inside of here. And what do we do inside of here? Well, it's simple. We just add on the and symbol. And this will always add an and symbol at the end of the current string that we just added to the final string, as long as we are not at the very last key. So when I save this, here we are passing. That logic is working. And as we mentioned in the paramify video, this logic isn't always great to work with. It is a lot nicer to use an array and just then call join at the end of it, because join will place a delimiter in between each of an individual index, and it won't add it at the very last key, or the very last index won't have the delimiter at the end. If we commented out this logic, and let's just say we took final string plus equals the and sign. Now when we look at this, notice we're failing because on the second test spec, size equals 14 and, like we don't need that. And then in the second test spec, height equals 74 and width equals 12 and. But with our logic, this isn't added on everywhere. It's added on the and symbol as long as we are not on the last key in the array. So let's go ahead and move on to the next spec. Convert an object with many elements. So this spec has an object with 6 key value pairs, and the string should be a equals 1, b equals 2, c equals 3, and so on. When we run this, notice we are passing that spec, converts an object with many elements. So let's move on to the next spec. Outputs the parameters in alphabetical order. This is the same exact spec from our paramify function, where we had f, e, d, c, b, a as the key value pairs, or as the keys. Notice they are starting at f and not at a, but the string returned has a equals 1, b equals 2, c equals 3. So the string returned is rearranging these key value pairs and returning a string with those key value pairs in alphabetical order. And as we learned previously, we can use the sort function or the sort method for this. So when I comment this in, save this, notice we're failing. Our string we're returning is not sorted, but we can do that pretty easily right above. So array of key names is an array of all the key names. For this specific test spec, they will be in reverse order or reverse alphabetical order, where it's F, E, D, C, B, A. To rearrange that, we can take array of key names and call array of key names dot sort. And this will sort everything into an alphabetized order and return that array. And actually, let me double check sort, because I forget, whether or not sort returns a brand new array or if it just rearranges the existing array. We may not have to make this assignment here. So let me double check. The way we can do this is we can look into documentation. So we have array.prototype.sort mdn. That's normally how I just quickly search for things. And if we look at this, the method sorts the elements of an array in place and returns the array. So it doesn't recreate a new array, it returns the existing array. So all we have to do is just call array of key names.sort. We don't have to assign it to a new variable. So when I save this and look at the code, whether or not we're passing or failing, notice we're now passing that spec. Outputs the parameters in alphabetical order. It's a little redundant to have lines 2 and then calling sort on line 3. What I want to do is refactor this slightly and use something called method chaining. So object.keys returns an array, right? It returns an array of all the key names. And then the moment that array is returned, all I want to do is then call sort on it. And then sort will return the array to array of key names. So if I comment this out and I save this code, we'll still pass that test back, as we can see here. This takes out the redundancy of line 3, and this condenses our code a little bit, which is always nice. And we're going to do a bigger refactor of this code at the end of this video. But for now, let's continue passing test specs because we are doing a great job. Let's look at the next spec here. Skips properties of the object's prototype. And we saw this before. With a for in loop, if we attach a property of our own someplace in its prototype chain, that property is considered enumerable. And that's not necessarily the technical definition of it, but that's the way I like to think of it. And enumerable properties are always iterated over when you use a for in loop. So in this example, here we have a alphabet function, and this alphabet function is using the this keyword into it. And it's also capitalized. So this is a hint. This might be used as a constructor function. Next, we add this C property onto the function's prototype object, and we assign the value 3 to it. Now on line 263, we use alphabet as a constructor function. We invoke it with the new keyword. So it's invoked and it returns an instance. The instance should have the key value pairs A equals 1 and B equals 2, and then up its prototype chain, it has the access to C, which holds the value 3. And this C property is considered enumerable because we are adding it ourselves in the spec. It's not built in on the prototype object. We added that. Since it's enumerable, the for in loop looped over the C property and added it. But object.keys is special. Object.keys only returns the keys that are on the object itself and not up its prototype chain. So it won't look at the enumerable properties up its prototype chain. So we don't have to use that has own property method that we used in the paramify function. And this is a nice advantage of object.keys. It eliminates this step for us. So when I save this code, I commented out the X, so I took it out, and now when I save this code and look at this spec in the browser, we should already be passing it. We shouldn't have to change anything else of our code, which we don't. We don't have to change our code at all. And that's because object.keys only returns the keys on the object and not enumerable properties up its prototype chain. All right, the last spec. Calls object.keys and does not use object.prototype.hasOwnProperty. So when I comment this out, or when I delete the X, I save this, we are probably already passing this test spec as well. Let's verify that, which we are. And if we look at the spec, it's just like the one in the paramify function. Notice here, we're spying on the object.prototype object, and we're specifically looking at the hasOwnProperty method. And on the object, we're spying on that as well, and we're looking at the keys method. Here, we create an object with a bunch of key value pairs, and now we finally call paramify-object-keys, and we pass in that object. So since we invoke this function, we can now test and see whether or not, we can now test our spies to see if things have been called or if things have not been called. And on line 276, notice we're testing object.keys, and we're testing to see if it was called or not. And this should return true. That's what to have been called is testing, whether or not object.keys was called. If it's called, great, we pass this spec. If it isn't called, you're going to fail this test spec. But we are calling it right here. Now if we look at the second spec, object.hasOwnProperty.calls.count, since we added a spy on hasOwnProperty, we can also use this method calls and count. This is provided to us by Jasmine. And all this test is doing is it will return the amount of times hasOwnProperty was called. Notice what we're testing here. We anticipate that has-own property is called 0 times. So it should not be used anywhere inside of paramify-object-keys, which we currently aren't using it anywhere. So this passes all the test specs. This is a great solution. And if you want to stay tuned, I'm going to go over a way to refactor this code. I'm going to use a method that will be introduced in a different section of foundations. I'm going to use the map method. If you're not familiar with map, no sweat. This is just more of a introduction to map and seeing how you can use map. I'm not going to go over it in depth, and don't worry if you don't know it. It's something that's going to be taught later in foundations in a lot more depth. This is just more of a video for any students that are familiar with map. I can show you how you can use it here. So I'm actually going to delete all this code. Well, not all of it, most of it. I'm going to comment all this out. And we're going to start right here. First, we create the keys object. We create the keys array, then we sort it. Now we're going to call the map method. And with the map method, it gets each individual key inside of our keys array. So the first argument passed in is key. And now we want to do something with each individual key. And what do we want to do? Well, we want to return a new string that has the key equals, and then key obj, right? That's the key value pair that we were generating inside of our loop from before. And keep in mind the map method returns a brand new array, and for every single iteration, it'll return this value as an index in the new array that map creates. Once again, if you're not familiar with map, I'm not going to go over it in too much in depth here. This is more of a video if you do have some exposure to map and want to try to use it in your solution. Map will be introduced later in foundations. So up until this point, let's see what is returned from paramify object keys. It should be an array, and the array should be populated with individual indexes with strings that look like, that have this format, with the key equals and then the value. So I'll save this. We're failing all of our specs, which is expected, because we're not returning any value here. So we have to return a value right here. Now when we return that value, notice what's happening here. Here we have size equals undefined, so something is wrong with the second portion of the string that we're populating, but notice an array is returned, and map returns that array. In the next spec, notice we have height equals undefined, width equals undefined, so we're properly getting the keys, but we're not getting the values properly. So let's take a look. Notice I made a big mistake here. I called the key and then the object. We don't want to do that. We want to call use bracket notation on the object with the key. So I just have to reverse what I had there. That should be good. So let's save that. And things are looking a lot better, right? Here we have size equals 14, so now we're getting the actual values. But now we have to take this array and merge it into a string, and we can't forget the delimiter that we have to put in between each individual index. But we already did that portion. We did that portion in paramify. Let's now do it in paramify object keys. So we have an array that we're returning, and we want to call the join method to take that array and squish it together into a string. In addition to that, we want to add a delimiter. So the delimiter is the and symbol, and this delimiter will be used whenever we are gluing together individual indexes. So for example, in this array that we are returning, when we call join, it'll take each individual index and concatenate them together. But when you add a delimiter, when you take the 0th index here and you concatenate it together with the second index, it concatenates with your delimiter. So it'll put these in between. And when you're on the last item in the array, it doesn't add that delimiter on into the end. So that funky logic we had before, right here in this if statement, we don't need it at all. The join method will handle that for us, which is great. So now if I were to save this code, we already added the join method on with the delimiter, we should be passing everything. So when I look at the solution, notice everything's passing, which is great. So this was our code from before refactored. We used the map method, which once again, this will be introduced in a lot more depth later in foundations. This video is not designed to be a complete instruction on how to use map. We're using a concept called method chaining here, where first we call object.keys. It returns an array, so we call sort. Sort then returns a sorted version of the array. And then we call map. map then maps over the whole entire array, creating new indexes, and it creates a brand new array, and then we return that new array. Then when that array is returned, we call join on that array, and we pass in a delimiter to join. And what does join return? It returns the final string. Join takes an array and glues it all together into a string. So this is another solution to the paramify-object-keys function. Once again, the other solution was great. If you're comfortable with that solution, I highly suggest studying that. And we'll get into more of these concepts with method chaining and using map later in foundations. The key, I'm sorry, one last thing. The key here was to get familiar with using object.keys.